Hi, everybody. Sorry to be a couple minutes late. We have a lot going on here. But even with everything going on, I think it's very important that we have this discussion today on our efforts to combat wildlife trafficking. So I'd like to welcome all of you here. You all have an important role to play in our efforts, and so hearing what we're doing will be helpful to you, but it's also important for us to hear directly from many of the people who've worked for years on this issue. So we've deliberately gone out of our way to bring together current and former government officials today, members of the diplomatic corps, and people from the private sector and the NGO community who care about this. There are four people in particular that I'd highlight who are lending their voices today, who've played a critical role in raising the profile on these issues generally. Secretary of the Interior, Sally Jewell, who you'll hear from. The Interior Department has a tremendous amount of expertise to bring to bear on this issue, and I think can help partners around the world in their efforts. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who did a lot to raise this profile in her former position within the administration, but also around the world, and continues to be a powerful advocate for action in this regard. You'll also hear from her daughter, Chelsea Clinton, who's the vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, as well as Judith McHale, a former colleague of mine, former Undersecretary of State, focused on public diplomacy, who's had a long-standing commitment to these issues. And I understand that Congresswoman Betty McCollum is joining us today. There are several champions of this issue on the Hill, and this is clearly an issue where we can work on a bipartisan basis with members of Congress. Just to step back for a moment here, this is an issue that the President has increasingly focused on. On our trip to Africa, it came up in his discussions with African leaders, particularly in Tanzania, where he signed an executive order dealing with this issue. I think we all recognize that this is an intersection of a significant threat to wildlife, and particularly species, iconic species like elephants and rhinoceroses. It's also an issue related to organized crime and even terrorism, because wildlife trafficking has turned into a multi-billion-dollar illegal industry. And it's decimating Africa's iconic animal populations. But it's also, again, providing revenue for criminal syndicates and terrorist groups as well. So it's both a conservation concern and a national security concern as well. And what we've seen in recent years are networks of poachers, criminals, corrupt officials who are exploiting porous borders and weak institutions to profit from trading in protected animals, which threatens their existence. It threatens the ecotourism industry, frankly, that many African countries depend upon, and, as I said, international security. What we've seen are very negative trend lines. We've seen wildlife trafficking double since 2007. It's now estimated to be the fourth largest transnational crime in the world. In Kenya, the number of elephants killed by poachers increased eightfold from 2007 to 2012. And in South Africa, the number of rhinos poached for their horns jumped 50-fold over the same time period. It gives you a sense of the urgency of this crisis. So that's why in July, the President announced this executive order that will drive our current efforts to combat wildlife trafficking and assist, importantly, foreign governments in building their capacity to eradicate wildlife trafficking and the organized crime that is associated with it. He announced $10 million that will go to training and technical assistance for African partners to combat wildlife trafficking, just because there's an enormous capacity need. There's a need of will, again, particularly when you have corruption, porous borders, and officials, frankly, who can profit more from cooperating with wildlife trafficking than cooperating with the international community's efforts to prevent it. But there's also just an issue of capacity. How do you patch those holes in borders? How do you monitor the efforts of these trafficking networks? These are the types of issues that we're focused on. The executive order established a presidential-level task force that will develop a national strategy to combat wildlife trafficking. It also established an advisory council made up of partners from NGOs, the private sector, and academia that will advise our task force as part of our broader engagement. And again, I can't underscore enough, we very much believe this is one of those issues where so much expertise and experience lies outside the government. And so there's no success that we'll be able to have without drawing on that expertise. So again, before I turn it over to Secretary Jewell, I just want to say that this is an issue where the trend lines are bad, but we also believe that action can make a big difference. That if we can raise the profile of this issue internationally, if we can work to build capacity with our African partners, work to build awareness and capacity in Asia as well, which is the destination for a lot of this, as well as here in the United States, we can reverse these negative trends. So it's one of those issues where the scope of the problem can be met with solutions. And the U.S. government can't do this on its own, but by bringing together and convening different efforts, like many of you have undertaken in the room here today, we think we can make a difference. So now I'd like to turn it over to Secretary Jewell, who's the co-chair of the President's Task Force on Wildlife Trafficking. She'll be able to introduce our new advisory council. Undersecretary McHale will then moderate a very constructive dialogue about the way forward with a panel made up of members of our advisory council. And then you'll hear from Secretary Clinton and Chelsea Clinton, who will close out the forum with their remarks. So I'm very grateful to Secretary Jewell for being here, but also for her leadership on this issue, and wish you all a very constructive discussion today.
Thank you, Ben. Probably goes without saying that he's just got a few things on his plate today as the Deputy National Security Advisor, so really appreciate Ben making time, and apologies for the late start. I think we can all understand why. I really want to thank former Secretary Clinton, Chelsea Clinton, and Ben for their leadership on this issue, and my boss, the President of the United States, who has stepped up not only with an executive order, but with his words and his travels to help bring awareness to the challenge of wildlife trafficking. I also want to recognize that this is a sort of a three-tiered effort on the part of the executive branch. The Justice Department and the State Department are co-leading this initiative, and we have Bob Dreher and Carrie Ann Jones from Justice and State, respectively, and they're in the front row if you just want to wave, see who they are. In her time at the State Department, Secretary Clinton led the charge to make wildlife trafficking a presidential-level priority. Now in the private sector, she continues to build support for the issue, and her work illustrates the importance of both government and the private sector working together to combat this really challenging struggle that we all have. The administration believes that government works best when we work closely with our partners, and that's why we're here today. And as several of our panel members commented, this was a very fast process from start to finish, and so we're delighted that the Advisory Council stepped up, and in a few minutes I'm going to be announcing them today. I'm really thankful to those citizens for stepping forward to support in this effort. So let me talk a little bit about the urgency. Ben already said part of it. Wildlife trafficking, the poaching and illegal trade of endangered wildlife, is a crisis that deserves our highest attention. This is shocking to me, but wildlife trafficking has doubled since 2007. It's now estimated to be the fourth largest transnational crime in the world, with revenues totaling many, many billions of dollars. Ben said in Kenya, elephant poaching increased 8-fold. In South Africa, rhino poaching increased 50-fold. That is just extraordinary. I visited South Africa back in 1981. Rhinos were plentiful. Some of the rhinos I saw are now endangered, and that's true with rhinos really all over this planet. There's also an enormous human cost to wildlife trafficking. Hundreds of park rangers have been killed in the line of duty just over the last few years. There's been an infusion of weapons and illicit money. It destabilizes our allies, harms local communities, and really has made this a very professional enterprise at which animals are bearing the challenge. Wildlife means economic development for our allies. Back in 2002, I had an opportunity to go to Tanzania, to go to the Serengeti with my son. And there's no question that tourism drives that economy there. Less wildlife means fewer tourists, means less revenue for local communities, not to mention a greater fear for people about going to these special places and what might actually happen to them. Global demand for wildlife products has soared, which is just shocking. It's soared, driving prices and poaching up. Prices of rhino horn are now worth 2 times their weight in gold, which is hard to believe. And unfortunately and embarrassingly, the United States of America is one of the world's largest markets for wildlife products. We have a huge role to play domestically. So there's no time to waste in addressing this issue for the American people and our allies abroad. So the Interior Department, which oversees the Fish and Wildlife Service, works across the globe with partners to ensure effective implementation of wildlife treaties and U.S. wildlife laws. We have a 4-pronged approach to combat wildlife trafficking. Domestic law enforcement, including special investigations and port inspections that give us the opportunity to take care of this at home, to arrest people. Technical capacity, or assistance to build capacity. sustainable levels of trade, meaning what is sustainable and what is not, and enforcing those rules, and then taking measures to reduce demand for illegal wildlife products in consuming countries. So it hasn't been fun to operate in this job for the last 5 months under sequestration. It hasn't helped us. It's limited our capacity, for example, this summer for the Fish and Wildlife Service wildlife inspectors to target passenger flights. Its inspection staff have had large numbers of vacancies, which has hampered their efforts to enforce anti-smuggling. And of course, the smugglers know this well. They've figured that out. They're pretty sharp. So bringing this forum together, bringing awareness to this issue, making sure that our elected officials know about it is going to be very helpful. I just want to give a quick nod to Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, who's here, who works on these issues through the International Conservation Caucus in the Senate, and we really appreciate his willingness to join us today. So we have a few announcements I'll make quickly. In spite of sequestration, there are a few areas where we can move forward. We provided critical support through the Fish and Wildlife Service for 171 projects that benefited African and Asian elephants, rhinos, tigers, great apes, and marine turtles. I was just commenting on our panel members' ties that tie into just about every one of these species. David, you got to up your game on your ties. But it's nice, actually, to have them on the radar, to put them on your body so that people ask the question, and then you can talk a little bit more about what's happening on these, with these programs. Projects are going to receive more than $8.6 million in grants from the Fish and Wildlife Service, matched by $14.3 million from African governments and non-governmental organizations. These are good investments for the United States, and it's critical that we continue to support these programs going forward, and we'll certainly be making that case on the Hill with our budget. We're also closing loopholes to assist law enforcement in cracking down on traffickers. The Fish and Wildlife Service will soon list the southern white rhino as a threatened species. You can't tell the difference between a rhino horn that comes from a southern white rhino and other rhinos. And so there are provisions of the Endangered Species Act that enable us to do this, so that we can make sure that people can't use that as a loophole to bring in rhino horn. The ESA, Endangered Species Act, already protects the Javan, Sumatran, Indian, black, and northern white rhinoceroses. By extending protection to the last subspecies, law enforcement will be better able to enforce rhino horn rules across the board. The next thing we are committed to doing is destroying the stock that we have of ivory. The Fish and Wildlife Service has 6 tons of seized contraband ivory. We are going to be having an event next month where all of that ivory is crushed, consistent with what has happened in a number of allies in Africa who have taken this difficult step, even though if they sold them on the global marketplace, it would mean a great deal of money. The U.S. supports these actions, and we want to make sure that we are doing the same in kind. This event will raise awareness among ivory consumers of the devastating impact that demand for ivory is having on elephant populations, and will call attention to the international effort to curb the illegal ivory trade. So we'll be working with public relations, and we appreciate all the cameras that are here today. We hope you focus not only on the immediate crisis at hand, but the topic that we're here to talk about today, illegal wildlife trafficking, because it's a big issue. So finally, at the direction of President Obama, I'm today formally appointing experts from the private and nonprofit sectors as members of the Advisory Council on Wildlife Trafficking. These individuals represent broad expertise in areas such as law enforcement and criminal justice, wildlife biology and conservation, finance and trade, communications and public relations, economic development, and international relations and diplomacy. I'd just like the members of the council, as I call your names, and the alternates, to wave or stand up briefly as I recognize you. I'd like the audience to hold your applause, even though I'm sure it will be thunderous for every one of them, until I finish introducing them, and then we'll have a big round of applause for everyone. So the members of the Advisory Council are Judith McHale, who's agreed to serve as council chair. She is the president and CEO of Kane Investments and former Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, and formerly president and CEO of Discovery Communications, which is the Discovery Channel. And we certainly know why this issue would be of interest to you, Judith, and are so appreciative of you stepping up to lead this effort. David Barron is chairman of the board of the International Conservation Caucus Foundation, a leader in rallying Congress around this issue. David's recently returned from Africa, where he led a congressional delegation examining the situation on the ground. Patrick Bergen is the president and CEO of the African Wildlife Foundation. Starting with AWF as a field-based community officer, Patrick has forged strong partnerships in Africa over the course of his 25 years of work there. Todd Cohen, who I don't think is able to be with us today, is Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at eBay, a company that has been a leader in the private sector at cracking down on the trade in endangered wildlife. David Hayes, my recently former colleague, is currently a distinguished visiting lecturer of law at Stanford Law School, and he's the former Deputy Secretary of the Interior and helped me get my sea legs in my first few months on the job. David has extensive experience in environmental law and a deep understanding of the U.S. government's role in this issue, and certainly was behind the scenes playing a big role in supporting the President in the executive order. Carter Roberts is CEO of the World Wildlife Fund, an organization with over 5 million members worldwide. He's got a track record of working closely with the private sector to forge conservation initiatives that are good for the planet and also good for business. Christiane Samper is president and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society and former director of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History. He's an active field biologist and an authority on cloud forest ecosystems. John Webb is an expert in wildlife law enforcement, having spent 35 years in the federal government, most recently as Assistant Chief of Environmental Crimes at the Department of Justice. He's currently working to support international law enforcement efforts in Southeast Asia. And then we have 4 alternates, and I appreciate them stepping forward as well, saying this is kind of like a jury. You pick the jury and you pick the alternates, and the alternates go through the whole process just so that any of them could step in at a moment's notice. So thank you for stepping forward. Crawford Allen is the North American Director of Traffic and has led investigations on black market transactions in dozens of countries. He's helped to pioneer regional law enforcement networks that are cracking down on this illegal trade. Stanley Asa, assistant professor at the University of Washington, my alma mater, is an expert in understanding the human dimensions of conservation, including work done in his native Cameroon. Marcus Asner is a partner at the law firm Arnold & Porter and formerly an assistant U.S. attorney in New York, where he led the successful prosecution of one of the largest poaching cases in history. And Susan Lieberman, who could not be with us today, she's formerly senior director at the Pew Charitable Trust, an expert in CITES, and a biologist with expertise in marine science. Sorry she couldn't be here today. Most of them are here, which we really appreciate. So let's give all of them a thunderous round of applause. So this is a really exceptional group of experts who signed up to do this and were approved through the process with lightning speed. So no one can say the federal government can't move fast. It moves fast with the help of a number of people, and I want to thank everyone that's made this come together. So I have the privilege now of welcoming our panel for today, including the moderator and council chair, Judith McHale. As mentioned, Judith is the president and CEO of Kane Investments, formerly Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, and with the Discovery Communications. Please join me in welcoming Judith and other members of the panel to the stage.
Thank you, Secretary Jewell, and thank all of you for joining us here today. I'm delighted to be here with you and honored to serve as the chair of the Advisory Council. I want to personally thank President Obama, Secretary Jewell, and Ben Rhodes for their leadership and for their commitment to this critical issue. I'd like to start our discussion by briefly going through the bios and giving you a little bit of more context for my fellow panelists today. David Hayes is a distinguished visiting lecturer at law at Stanford Law. He only just recently moved out there, and a senior fellow at the William and Flora Hewitt Foundation. From 2009 until 2013, he served as the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Interior, where he was actively engaged in domestic and international wildlife issues. During the Clinton administration, David served as counselor to Secretary Babbitt and then as Deputy Secretary. David is also a former environmental attorney in private practice, having chaired the Environment and Land Resource Division at Latham & Watkins. Carter Roberts is the president and CEO of World Wildlife Fund in the United States. WWF is the world's largest network of international conservation organizations working across 100 countries with 5 million members worldwide. At WWF, Carter has spearheaded initiatives on global wildlife trade, food production, rainforest protection, and sustainable development. Carter is an expert on private-public sector partnerships and has experience in both the private and public sectors. Dr. Christian Samper is president and CEO of the Wildlife Conservation Society, which oversees field programs in 65 nations and oversees major scientific institutions, including the Bronx Zoo in my home city of New York, and the New York Aquarium, both in New York, obviously. Prior to joining WCF, Christian served as director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, the world's largest natural history collection. Christian is recognized authority on tropical ecosystems, especially those found in and around his native Colombia. John Webb is formerly the Assistant Chief of the Environmental Crimes Section at the United States Department of Justice. John is an expert on wildlife crime, having prosecuted hundreds of wildlife trafficking cases in his 35-year career in the federal government. John continues to advise law enforcement entities around the world, most recently supporting the anti-trafficking efforts of the Southeast Asian Wildlife Enforcement Network headquartered in Bangkok. As you can see, we have a broad range of expertise here to discuss what is clearly a complex and multifaceted problem. Wildlife trafficking is a global crisis that impacts conservation, international trade, law and order, national security, and public health. It is a problem that spans nations, areas of expertise, and government agencies. In order to solve the problem of wildlife trafficking, we must work together across borders, across sectors, and across our traditional spheres of engagement and form coordinated strategies. That is what today and this broader effort is all about. We all know the statistics. Wildlife trafficking is now one of the most lucrative types of transnational organized crime in the world, with revenues upwards of $10 billion annually. The poaching of African elephants and rhinos has exploded over the past 5 years, particularly in Central Africa, but also now in Eastern and Southern Africa as well. Meanwhile, there are species that have been at a critical level for some time, including tigers, Asian rhinos, and great apes, that are at risk of being wiped out completely. We know that exploding demand, particularly from Southeast Asia, but also from the United States, is driving global prices for animal products skyward. The price of rhino horn, for example, is now higher than the price of gold. And rising prices have made wildlife trade an attractive enterprise for criminal organizations. As a result, poaching has become more violent and more militarized than ever before, infusing instability into nations and putting lives at risk. This unprecedented threat to wildlife compels us to act, and to act now. Wildlife forms the backbone of local economies and is a point of national pride for our partners around the world. Yes, we talk about wildlife trafficking because it impacts livelihoods and lives, but also because it impacts our shared heritage and threatens our future. Ben Rhodes and Secretary Jewell have explained what the government is doing to address the crisis of wildlife trafficking. And we on the advisory committee will be making recommendations on what else can be done by government. But this problem will not be solved by government alone. And so today, we are here to discuss what the private and nonprofit sectors working together with government can do to address this issue. We have done this before, and we can do it again, but we must act now. We must work harder and faster, and we must use all the tools and resources of the 21st century to address this most pressing of issues. Our future and the future of generations to come depends on it. So what we thought we'd like to do this afternoon is we're going to kick it off with some questions. I'm going to ask my fellow panelists some questions, but we really want this to be an interactive discussion and dialogue with all of you here as well, because I'm a big believer there's no limit on great ideas, and I think the only way we will be able to solve this problem, and hopefully now and into the future, is by engaging more broadly and finding avenues and paths to connect the government and help the government and the private sector work very closely and collaboratively together to address this critical issue. So we're going to start off with panel discussions, some of our panelists answering some questions, and then open it to all of you. And with that, I'd like to start off with David and ask David a question. Earlier this year, before the President's visit, you traveled to Tanzania and met with USG officials and officials from the Tanzanian government. What did you learn from that experience about the impact poaching is having on the governance of our partners and allies around the world?
Thank you, Judith. I did go to Tanzania in my former capacity as Deputy Secretary of the Interior in February, and spent a lot of time with the leadership in Tanzania, particularly with Minister Kagashaki, who's the Minister of Tourism and Natural Resources. And my observations talking with him and his team, and also the ambassador and the U.S. team there, is that there's a recognition that this is a very destabilizing situation. Destabilizing for the governments in Africa that are most affected, Tanzania certainly being near the top, if not at the top of the list. This is a situation that is out of control. There's a lawlessness inherent to this situation, obviously. There are corruption issues. The amount of money involved is tremendous. And on the flip side, there is an appreciation, increasing appreciation for the economic cost of this situation to the countries like Tanzania. It's estimated that tourism brings at least $4 billion a year into the Tanzanian economy. At least 15% of the economy is dependent upon tourism. And Minister Kagashaki and others realize that a lot of folks are coming to see those iconic elephants and to see nature at work in the Serengeti without the scourge of poaching. The other observation I'd make in terms of governance is that there's an appreciation that no country by itself can address this situation. It really requires an international response. Obviously, the demand side is huge, and not unlike the drug trade, there has to be a coordinated effort, both in terms of trying to stop the source as well as the demand side. And so our allies recognize from a governance perspective that we have to work together in the international community. We have some structures to do that, but obviously in the past few years, given the statistics that Ben and Secretary Jewell both commented on, we're losing, and losing badly. We need to bring more attention to it and take advantage of the fact that there are leaders like President Kikwete, who hosted the president. When the president made the executive order announcement on July 2nd, those leaders want our help and the international community's help. In fact, Minister Kagashaki has called an elephant summit himself in Tanzania, bringing together African countries and other experts, and the U.S., I'm sure, will be involved in that as well. So, long-winded answer, Judith, but I think that one of the game changers here that has occurred is that many of our allies recognized that there's a significant governance destabilization occurring because of the nature of the poaching crisis.
I know there are a number of U.S. government projects and programs that sort of aimed at addressing this issue, but can you talk a little bit about what some of the things that are going on either through USAID or the MCC initiatives that we've already undertaken? Because we've been doing a lot, and yet the progress has been slow, and we're trying to pick it up.
We have, and in fact, there's been a long history of bipartisan support, and it's great to have Senator Whitehouse here for the government activities in Africa, recognizing the international implications of wildlife support. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, although Secretary Jewell is the Secretary of the Department of the Interior, don't be misled by that. In fact, the Fish and Wildlife Service has for many years in Africa had a robust program of support for wildlife issues. In fact, I was in Tanzania largely to celebrate the opening of wildlife management areas, where the Fish and Wildlife Service is working to create capacity and legal structures to provide opportunities for local communities to take advantage of the tourism, et cetera, that's happening with robust wildlife populations in those areas through wildlife management centers, and wildlife management areas. And also, the President announced in connection with the executive order the addition of a Fish and Wildlife Service expert that the government of Tanzania asked for in Dar es Salaam. That person is packing her bags right now to go. And of course, the Fish and Wildlife Service is the U.S. government entity that administers the CITES Convention, which is the framework for regulating the trade in endangered species. And there are very important developments there coming out of the Bangkok meeting last year, including a recognition that at least 8 major nations, including Tanzania, China, and others, have some severe issues in terms of policing the wildlife trafficking, and they're required to come up with action plans by next spring. So there are, we've got some U.S. government resources in play in Africa. And then we've got the U.S. role in the international context that is a very robust role right now. What we haven't had, Judith, until the president did his executive order, we have not had the kind of coordinated top prioritization of this issue across the government, bringing together the Fish and Wildlife Service, USAID, the State Department, the Department of Justice in a more organized and cohesive way. And that's what the task force that Secretary Jewell is co-chairing with the Attorney General Holder and Secretary Kerry is all about. And our role, I think, is to help them succeed.
Well, I agree with you, and I think the sort of issuance of the executive order is critically important dynamic where you now have a whole of government approach to this and government working across agencies and departments to find workable solutions, and then with the advisory council working as almost a bridge from the private sector to government so that we can all work together to find these important find solutions to these critical problems. And clearly it's a global challenge. And the only way forward is to really find ways to work together. Christian, everybody's talked about and everybody knows that we can't solve this problem without addressing the demand side of the equation, if you will. And it is demand everywhere, and we all understand that that's a huge challenge. I'm a big believer in when you have that in the whole concept of public education, making people actually aware of what is going on, what the consequences are of their purchases of ivory and others. In many cases, people are totally unaware of it. Can you have a background coming from Smithsonian and then the Bronx Zoo and other places in terms of public education. What do you think we can do, and what kind of programs and initiatives would you think we could take a look at? And can you talk about perhaps some of the other campaigns that might have worked?
Thanks, Judith. There's no doubt the reason we have illegal wildlife trafficking is the demand for some of these products, and that's a fact of life, and most of these is international. So there's no doubt that driving awareness of the issues and both the truths and the myths behind this is something really important. Take the case of ivory. We know that this is being driven largely by markets in Asia, China, and other places. A lot of the trade in rhino horn is linked to misperceptions about the potential medicinal properties of this. The science is clear that there are no direct benefits. So a lot of it is getting that information out. And there's no doubt that zoos, aquariums, museums have a critical role to play there. The zoos in the US alone host 170 million visits a year. The zoos worldwide host over 750 million visits every year. We can get some content out there and work with media, companies, and as well, one of the things we're trying to do right now in places like China is working with social media and using social media to create awareness. Because I do think a lot of the people that are consuming some of these products don't necessarily know where it comes from or don't fully appreciate the impact that it is having. But the thing that worries us as well is that although ultimately reducing demand is what's really going to solve the problem, there's going to be a time lag there. And what we have been focusing on is a three-pronged strategy. We need to stop the killing, we need to stop the trafficking, and we need to stop the demand. And in the short term, there's no doubt that for things like elephants and rhinos, we absolutely have to secure the populations that are out there. We know what needs to be done. Many of the groups in this room are working on it with the governments, with local partners. We can step up our game and really secure some of these populations until we can really create awareness. And one thing I think is important, and maybe we can come back to this later, is sometimes when you focus on these issues, you think that it's a war that's lost already, that everything, all the trends are negative. Well, don't forget that we went through this path, and I think you mentioned that there. We were losing the battle with elephants before, and when the CITES listings happened and others, the populations of elephants recovered. So we can actually, if we take these measures, wildlife can actually recover if we give them a fair chance. The same thing hopefully will happen with sharks, which is another one where I think the listing in CITES is really important. And the data we have for some of the places in tigers and tiger trade shows that wildlife can really recover as long as we stop the demand, we tackle the trafficking that I'm sure John is going to talk about, and we tackle the demand.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I think one of the things that was that I've been focused on and thinking about for the past couple of days, I think when I was at Discovery, we did an enormous amount of wildlife programming, and we actually, our first original program was done in 1989, 1990, and it was called Ivory Wars. And it brought to the public's attention what was going on with the African elephant. And it was so startling to me to sort of look back on that and go, here we are again. And I think one of the things we all want to focus on, and with your help, try to come up with some really innovative approaches to be sure that this doesn't happen. Yes, wildlife, we've demonstrated that wildlife can recover, but I want to be, but we seem to be pushing it to the edge of a cliff and then having to scramble to bring it back. And I want to see if we can come up with some innovative, lasting approaches to see that we don't get to the edge of that cliff again. And I think public education is going to be a part of that, because you know, even I was involved in all of those issues and then took a little bit of a mental vacation from it, I guess, for a while, and then was startled to see how rapidly it had turned around. And so I think that's one of the things that we're going to be looking to for education. Carter, before joining the nonprofit world, you were a marketing manager at Procter & Gamble, and as part of your leadership of WWF, you've forged relationships with industry giants such as Coca-Cola, Walmart, and others. For the wildlife trafficking issue in particular, what kind of private industry partnerships can we do, and how do you see the whole area of public education? You've got a marketing background as well, and I know that this is a critically important part. Maybe you could also talk a little bit about technology, the technologies that we have today, and what role they can play in helping solve this problem.
Thanks, Judith. Yeah, it is, there is no question that we will not win unless we are able to build bridges with the private sector and with governments around the world. And, you know, the United States has a very particular role to play. If you think about our private sector, our industries, those industries in particular that relate to technology and to communications and to global supply chains have a disproportionate role to play here. Just last year, Google announced a major initiative with WWF around pioneering new technologies around wildlife trade, using cell phone technologies to track animals, using other technologies, aerial imagery to track poachers, and using new software programs to bring park rangers on the ground to the places where the killing happens before it's too late. We are being outgunned right now by these criminal syndicates. They have night vision goggles, they have helicopters, they have lots of sophisticated arms. And one of the key tools at our disposal is going to be technology and inventing new ways to catch the bad guys before it's too late. The other is communications. Leading up to the CITES convention, we worked with one of our board members, Leonardo DiCaprio, to launch a campaign to tell the story of wildlife trade, to gather signatures, to deliver them to the Prime Minister of Thailand, and to urge that government, which controls the largest ivory trade in the world, to pledge to end the trade in their country. And she did that. And it is an important step forward. But I think if you think about our American industries, and you think about the marketing giants that we have, whether it's Hollywood or the biggest consumer goods companies or others, companies like eBay, the role that they have of telling these stories and engaging the public, whether it's here in the United States or abroad, is going to be fundamental. And the last is supply chain. We know that significant parts of the supply chains of companies around the world are illegal. And whether it's tuna, or whether it's seafood, or whether it's things that relate to the parts derived from these animals, we know that all the companies that we work with do not want to run a company that in any way encourages or abets this trade. And so engaging industries like Bumblebee, engaging companies like eBay, engaging companies like Google in thinking about how do you eliminate illegal products from everything that they do is something that resonates across the general public and with these companies, and is something that I think represents a real area of traction for us, particularly with this trade. So as Chris John said, there are all kinds of signs of hope. At the beginning of the last century, we had as little as 100 white rhinos left on Earth, 100 white rhinos left on Earth. There are now 20,000. And there is all the signs in the world that if we focus on this issue, we can address this issue and we can solve this issue. And that's also part of the story that needs to be told.
Great. So lots of opportunities to sort of coordinate efforts between the private sector and government, which is one of the things that I think about this advisory council is a sort of an innovative approach to trying to solve this problem. How do we build those bridges? I know there are many representatives from NGOs and private sector organizations here with us today. And sometimes it's hard to work with government. I found that both inside and outside government. And we want to try to look to make that more effective because there's only by working together can we be sort of really find lasting solutions to this problem. And it's challenging, obviously. I think we would all agree, particularly as you look around the world, how are we going to engage populations around the world on this issue? John, we've talked about stopping the demand, and we know that that's critically important. But the other two components, as Christian laid out for us, are stopping the killing and stopping the trafficking. And obviously, there's a huge law enforcement component to that. And you've spent years looking at this issue, and I'd love to have you share with us some of the benefits of the knowledge that you've gained over that in terms of what are the law enforcement dimensions that we're looking at, how can we get better at it, and how can we share those best practices that you've sort of built over the years with our partners and allies around the world.
Well, thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank the co-chairs of the task force for my appointment, and I'd like to congratulate my fellow council members for their appointment and look forward to our working association. I spent 25 years at the Department of Justice, and I would say that the power of the Department of Justice is called upon when voluntary compliance fails. And what is it that the Department of Justice brings to the table? Because we bring our prosecution arm. The Department of Justice has been a valuable player in the effort to fight illegal wildlife trafficking for decades. In fact, in the late 1970s, President Carter, recognizing the impact that illegal trafficking was having on the recently listed CITES species from the 1976 Washington Convention, was concerned that this growing trade in the late 90s was going to have a deleterious effect on wildlife, and wanted to have specialized prosecutors within the Department of Justice who could now handle that growing sophistication that the smugglers were showing. And that became the Wildlife and Marine Resources section, and literally just a handful of prosecutors. That effort within the Department of Justice now has grown so that on any given day, the specialty prosecutors within the Department of Justice who, on a full-time basis in their headquarters, prosecute wildlife crime, has grown to 20 or 25 attorneys who may be working on a wildlife case. Beyond that, U.S. attorneys' offices in our major cities across the country either have specialized prosecution units also fighting this illegal wildlife trafficking, or have attorneys who are dedicated to that task. And one of our council members, Marcus Asner, was one of those individuals in the Southern District of New York, in Manhattan, concerned enough about the scope of illegal wildlife trade that what many might consider the most prestigious U.S. Attorney's Office in our country, tackled a wildlife trafficking case, and did so with the, results that are beyond spectacular, quite frankly. The philosophy, for lack of a better term, on prosecuting cases and trying to interdict wildlife trafficking is sort of threefold. We talk about these being important cases to work on, that we have many tools to do so, and that we have good results. Important cases only demonstrates that there is a dramatic loss of wildlife that's occurring worldwide, and that one way that we can slow that down is to be able to tell people that to continue to engage in this practice runs the risk, if you come to the United States, of being prosecuted. But what we have brought to the table in those prosecutions is an effort not only to use the traditional wildlife offenses that most people are familiar with like the Lacey Act and the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but we also now bring to the table the white-collar economic crime model. We want to dismantle these trafficking rings. We want to go after the head. We want to go after the tail, quite frankly. We want to follow the contraband. We want to follow the cash. We're no longer satisfied with merely seizing and forfeiting wildlife. We want to dismantle these rings. The second thing, and the people that we want to have that are working on these kinds of cases need to have the heart to want to do it. Of all the things that I've seen that people bring to the table who are effective crime fighters in the wildlife arena are the people who want to do it. You got to have the heart to do it. The second part, many tools, of course, is using the economic white-collar crime model, not only forfeitures, but money laundering, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. These are all the types of criminal charges that are now being used to fight wildlife traffickers. Good results. We put people in jail. Punishment deters. A mere forfeiture and a modest fine doesn't. There was a time when up to 1/3 of those people who were convicted of a wildlife crime went to jail, even though as many as 90 or 95% were pleading guilty. Extrapolate. If 95% of the people are pleading guilty and a third are going to jail, people who are committing wildlife crimes acknowledge that their activity can result in jail time. And that was an incredible breakthrough in the wildlife arena. And so one of the things that we'd like to try and do is to take this model and try and take the parts that are applicable to other countries worldwide and have them adopt it. And so we are trying as much as possible to get countries away from a mere seizure model into an active prosecution model where they go after the entire criminal network. And if we can accomplish that as partners with us, we're making a dramatic inroad into this illegal trade.
Thank you. You mentioned people have to have the heart and their heart in it, and clearly this room is filled with people who are committed and have that heart. We're going to turn to all of you for questions in 1 second, but just before we end, our part of this, I'm going to turn to my fellow panelists and put them on the spot a little bit and ask each of them to tell me or to tell us what the single most important thing you think the private and non-public sector can do to help with, in cooperation with government, to help address the crisis in wildlife trafficking. And David, I think we'll start with you.
Judith, I'd say, I can't say the single most. How about two things? Two things. Only one? The demand side issue and the public awareness issue is huge. And actually, the public awareness issue will, if this group, under the President's leadership, with former Secretary Clinton's continued leadership, and this advisory council hopefully helping, can bring to the American people and the world stage the severity of the issue, everything else will fall into place. The mechanics are here. The executive order lays out a whole of government approach. This advisory council is a unique way to get everyone involved, because this not only has to be a whole of government, it has to be a whole of civil society approach. So I think that's the single most important thing, Judith.
Christian?
In the short term, securing the species that are the brink, and I think we know exactly what needs to be done, and it's lining up the resources, lining up the people. Longer term, creating the awareness, working primarily through informal education.
Thank you. Carter?
There is no question that the commitment of heads of state is essential, and seeing African heads of state make a commitment, seeing the head of state of Thailand make a commitment, having our president sign an executive order to bring the whole government of the United States and its institutions to bear on this is essential. But putting that into action, what I've seen on the ground in Nepal and Namibia and other places is that, and when you talk to the law enforcement officials, the most essential thing is information. It is being able to infiltrate the syndicates, to work them upstream, not to catch the poachers, but to catch the guys who are paying the poachers and the guys who are selling the products into the markets. Being able to gather that information using technology, using all the resources available from all of our agencies, and this is something that Secretary Clinton did an amazing job of sending a signal that brought together our intelligence agencies to marshal those assets, is everything. So government commitments backed by information, I think, is key.
Thank you. And finally, John.
Not surprisingly, I'm going to echo some of the comments you just heard, because we look at non-governmental organizations, the civil society, as our enforcement partners. We're delighted that they have access to streams of information that sometimes we at the government don't have access to. We use that information in our prosecutions here in the United States. The non-governmental organizations can be our expert witnesses at trial. They help provide the court with additional information about why this crime is a serious crime, worthy of the court to look at as a serious crime and punish accordingly. So we have a very fortunate and very productive role. Overseas, the Department of Justice, along with the other investigative agencies, has been doing a lot of training. And in those training programs, we make it a point of appearing on the program together with our NGO partners as a demonstration to the foreign governments that we have a close, personal, working relationship that is not a threat to the Department of Justice or to the U.S. government, but in fact a cooperative, productive relationship, one that we think foreign governments ought to emulate. And that's the message we hope to send when we appear on the stage together. So we find the role that NGO players have in enforcement arena to be a quite productive and important role.
So we've talked a lot about the sort of magnitude of the crisis and the importance of all of us working together, and we sort of want to open it up to all of you. One of the key roles of the Advisory Council and why we are here is to ensure that there is a vibrant conversation between the private sector, non-NGOs, and government. So we'd like to open it to all of you to take any questions or comments or concerns that you might have. And we have someone with mics, I think, who will bring the mic to you. If you could just identify yourself and tell us what organization you're with, that would be very helpful.
Well, thank you. My name is Ho Young-an. I'm Ambassador of Korea here in town. First of all, thank you so much for organizing this meeting. I was listening to you, the members of the council, or commission. Which one is correct? Council.
Council.
Council, right. And then it is very interesting in the sense that each one of you are referring to CITES. And then it is with much meaning to me in the sense that it was 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, 1993. I was back in Seoul. I was something called the Director for International Treaties. And CITES Convention, Korea acceded to the CITES Convention back in 1993. And at the time, the assumption for me to working so hard so that Korea would be acceding to the CITES Convention, it was on the assumption that Korea acceded to the CITES, and then everybody access to the CITES, and then it will put an end, once and for all, to all the trade in endangered species. But it was not going to be the case. So I'm listening to you. I'm listening to the importance of education. I'm listening to you in the importance of public-private partnership. I'm listening to the importance of law enforcement. I'm listening to the importance of government's role, etc. But at the same time, other than awareness and other than information, let us just think about international architecture, because at the end of the day, this is an international issue, right? Let us just think about the international architecture, and then architecture is already there in the form of a CITES agreement. So I was just wondering if, say, for the past 20 years, then of course this example of white tigers, remaining 100 of them, and then now there are no less than 20,000 of them, is very impressive. But at the same time, I was just wondering, now we have it, CITES, and then let us just think about, so far as you, Council, is concerned, how about strengthening the structure as well as implementation of the CITES agreement? For example, challenge inspection. Challenge inspection, I don't think it is part of CITES as we have it today, but that would be one of the examples. But other than that, I was just wondering, given the background I have 20 years ago, acceding to the CITES, I was wondering if it could be strengthened in any means. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. As you pointed out, and as we all acknowledge, we keep making progress and then slipping back. And so how can we ensure this time that the progress is continues as we go forward. And I think one of the words that's come about, we've talked about, is being ever vigilant. But David, you want to talk about CITES?
Sure, very quickly. I mean, I think you make a very important point that we have an international framework through CITES, and we need to strengthen it. We also need to recognize the mistakes that CITES made in approving essentially one-off sales of ivory that created the potential for a faux good market for ivory and created the kind of confusion that has enabled the running room for poachers to go and give the sense that what they're doing is legal. So I think that mistake has been recognized, we hope, although frankly the Secretary Jewell's announcement that the U.S. is going to destroy its ivory stock is hugely important, and we have, you know, large ivory stocks in many countries that are time bombs in terms of this problem. The other issue on CITES is to make sure these action plans that are due in the spring for the 8 major countries that have acknowledged problems are meaningful, and that the international community really makes CITES an enforceable, strong document. And in that regard, I know that the Clinton Global Initiative is looking to get additional commitments by some leaders in Africa to deal with the in-country issues, and that's where probably CITES and certainly voluntary, but perhaps more initiatives can have a big role to play. The structure is there, and that's a big plus for taking advantage of now the prioritization the President is giving to this issue.
John?
Also, too, CITES allows member countries to enact stricter domestic measures. And that's a wonderful tool to address situations where a particular country is uncomfortable with the level of trade that's now occurring and wants to regulate it. The United States had a situation like that in the early 1990s as a result of an undercover investigation conducted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The extent of illegal trade in exotic birds was uncovered, principally parrots and macaws. And as a consequence of this incredible trade in these wild birds, a trade that used to number in the millions of birds coming in annually into the United States was ended under the Wild Bird Conservation Act, also called the Exotic Bird Conservation Act. So the United States employed a stricter domestic measure to end a market in exotic wild birds.
Thank you. Any other questions? In the back there.
Ann Schaefer, West Rhino. I work on the smaller species in Southeast Asia, and I'd like to, of which there are probably only 100 left of each one of them. I would like to thank the State Department for focusing more attention on these species, and thank you, Judith, for mentioning them in your introduction. This is what they really need. They need more attention, both in this country and over there, because even if these species, when and if they are lost, then we can certainly bring this up as at an issue. So I would like to encourage more attention being brought on these species. This country needs to know that we're paying attention and that we're with them and trying to save them. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there's another question right there.
Jamie Clark, President of Defenders of Wildlife. This is really exciting, and many of us in this audience are very grateful for the energy and the commitment to addressing this issue, which is actually increasing with its urgency. I actually have a comment followed by a question. So much of the world focuses its attention on what the United States is doing as we address conservation challenges of our time. And I believe we're at an interesting conservation crossroads when it comes to the framework of U.S. law, the Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, CITES is a part of the ESA. And how do you all on the panel see the importance of shoring up the Endangered Species Act, which the entire world is looking at now as an enforcement mechanism to deal with wildlife trafficking? John, you mentioned the MBTA, Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, but I I believe that the Endangered Species Act is in real troubled times. And it takes, we mentioned public awareness, we mentioned scientific integrity, we mentioned the challenges of enforcement, and I'd just be interested in your thoughts on how that frame of law factors into the combating of wildlife trafficking.
If I can take a quick crack at that, Jamie, now that I'm no longer part of the government, I can say I think that our penalties are not significant enough for wildlife trafficking. And despite the great enforcement work the Department of Justice has done in cooperation with Dan Ash and the Fish and Wildlife Service, we are not creating the kind of disincentive for wildlife trafficking that this problem deserves. I'll also say I think that this crisis helps folks appreciate why we have an Endangered Species Act. There are a lot of naysayers in this country about the ESA, and they focus on species that no one's heard of, that are causing a problem here or there. This is a reminder that the endangered species is all about biodiversity and protecting God's creatures, and what better example than an elephant or a rhino or a tiger. So I think we should welcome a debate about the Endangered Species Act in this context and lead with the suggestion that we increase the enforcement penalties. The U.S. has to show, we have to show the way. We're asking our friends in Africa to improve their legal processes. We should not be have so much hubris as to think that we've got it figured out here in the U.S. We need to do more.
Carter?
Yeah, as you were asking the question, I was reflecting there is a pattern in our community to point to other countries and ask them to do the right thing in solving any number of environmental issues. And it underscores the fact this is an incredibly complex global problem. We don't just need the African heads of state, we need Asian heads of state, and we need the head of state in the United States to make this a priority. So I love the fact that this executive order is directing the whole of government to get after this issue. I love the fact that Secretary Jewell has just announced we're going to destroy our ivory stockpiles here at home. And I love the fact that we're going to get after the market that exists here in the United States. Because we have work to do here, just as we're challenging other countries to do the same.
Thank you, and you're obviously leading a lot of the effort with your partnerships with eBay and Google and others. I think we have time for one more question or a comment over here.
Alan Thornton from the Environmental Investigation Agency, and I'd like to thank President Obama and former Secretary Clinton for launching this extremely important initiative against wildlife crime. I'd like to thank all the members of the Advisory Council for taking part, for your nomination. You've got a very big job ahead of you. I also want to thank David Hayes for his reference to Tanzania and raising the issue of corruption, which is often avoided in these discussions. In the past, when illegal logging, illegal timber trade came out, corruption was raised by the U.S. as a major issue, and it's become infused into the discussion since then. I think it's been very important, very productive, especially since the United States banned import of illegal timber in 2008. I wanted to ask David if he had any other insights into the situation in Tanzania. EIA was honored to work with the administration of President Mwinyi back in 1989 when they first proposed the Appendix 1 listing for all elephants. I went into the Dar es Salaam ivory room back then and filmed 89 tons of ivory. So last year when the government of Tanzania applied for a down listing again, said they had 114 tons of ivory. I was rather shocked because I thought they should really have 300 or 400 tons of ivory. The scope of illegal ivory trade coming out of Tanzania, the number of elephants being killed is bigger than any other range state as far as we can see. We've been very pleased that the president announced this initiative while in Tanzania. And the minister has made some very strong statements that there are people in senior levels of government, the military and police involved, And so far, we haven't heard, I haven't seen actually, a statement from President Kikwete that there is going to be a crackdown. I know the minister has promised a crackdown like the Operation New Hive from 1990, which closed down the illegal ivory trade in Tanzania. And we're hoping that Tanzania will take a bold step and really crush the ivory trade as they've done before. But do you see any real indication that the president is going to make some announcement? Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. I am the former Deputy Secretary of the Department of the Interior now, not the Department of State. I will just say that the fact that Minister Kagashaki is calling for an elephant summit, when I was with him in February on an official basis, he talked publicly about the problem of corruption, which I thought was really significant. And the fact the President was there with President Kikwete making this announcement, and I'm encouraged. Obviously, there's a lot to be done, but it is the fact that top-level officials in Tanzania are acknowledging the issue and interested in working with us. I'll also mention we have a new ambassador to Tanzania who has been nominated by the President, Mark Childress, who has a background in Africa. He was, until recently, the Deputy Chief of Staff for the President. He was very actively involved in this, and I think having individuals, presidential appointees like Mark, in the theater are going to be hugely helpful.
Thank you, David, and I want to thank my fellow panelists here today. This is obviously the beginning of what I hope will be a very vigorous discussion. We're looking forward. We want this to be a collaborative effort. In fact, that's the whole purpose of us being here today. So we will be encouraging you to please work with us as we work together to find solutions. So thank you very much for being here today. Now, I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker. Last November, then Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton announced a significant new initiative to focus the world's attention on the economic, security, and environmental challenge of wildlife trafficking. Now that Secretary Clinton has started her new work at the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation, she remains committed to this issue, recently convening leading conservation organizations in New York to mobilize and coordinate efforts across the private sector. She is here with us today to speak both from the perspective of our country's former first diplomat and also now as leader in the NGO community. Please join me in welcoming my former boss and good friend, former Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Thank you all. Thank you very much. Secretary Jewell, it's wonderful to see you, and thank you for that exciting announcement, very important on this issue earlier. Thanks to all of my former colleagues in government, thanks to all the ambassadors and other representatives of countries concerned about wildlife protection and the urgency of stopping the killing and the poaching. And thanks especially to the leaders of both American and international conservation groups who have been in the trenches for so long on this issue. I especially want to thank Judith McHale, who is chairing the Council of Distinguished Outside Advisors, some of whom you have just heard from. In addition to her service as Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, when Judith was president and CEO of Discovery Communications, she helped produce the landmark 1989 documentary, Ivory Wars, which built crucial support for passage of the International Convention on Wildlife Trafficking. And it is not only time, it's probably past time to galvanize a new international movement against poaching and trafficking. So it's wonderful having Judith and her colleagues back on this case. Before I get to the subject at hand, I'd like to say a few words about Syria. A vigorous and important debate is underway in Congress and around kitchen tables all over America. This is a challenge that has catalyzed the kind of debate that I think is good for our democracy. As you know, this is a fluid situation with statements from Russia, Syria, and others in the last several hours. I've just come from a meeting with President Obama where we discussed the latest developments, and 3 points in particular are at the heart of the decision our country and our Congress has to make in the days ahead. First, as the President has said, the Assad regime's inhuman use of weapons of mass destruction against innocent men, women, and children violates a universal norm at the heart of our global order. And therefore, it demands a strong response from the international community led by the United States. Second, the international community cannot ignore the ongoing threat from the Assad regime's stockpiles of chemical weapons, whether they are used again against Syrian civilians or transferred to Hezbollah or stolen by other terrorists. This is about protecting both the Syrian people and our friends in the region. The world will have to deal with this threat as swiftly and comprehensively as possible. Now, if the regime immediately surrendered its stockpiles to international control, as was suggested by Secretary Kerry and the Russians, that would be an important step. But this cannot be another excuse for delay or obstruction. And Russia has to support the international community's efforts sincerely or be held to account. It is very important to note that this discussion that has taken hold today about potential international control over Syria's stockpiles only could take place in the context of a credible military threat by the United States to keep pressure on the Syrian government as well as those supporting Syria, like Russia. Third, as has been emphasized many times, and I did so as Secretary of State, the broader conflict in Syria is a threat to regional stability and security of our allies and partners, as well as a humanitarian catastrophe for the Syrian people and those neighboring countries attempting to absorb hundreds of thousands, now more than 2 million refugees. Achieving a political solution that ends the conflict is in the interests of the United States. It will require an intense diplomatic effort guided by the roadmap that was agreed to by the international community in Geneva last year, in June of 2012. There was an agreement we hammered out that pointed the way forward. We need to get to the opportunity to begin such negotiations to move toward a resolution. The President and I discussed these challenges today. I will continue to support his efforts, and I hope that the Congress will as well. I also want to thank President Obama for making the fight against illegal wildlife trafficking a priority across the United States government, and for inviting me and Chelsea to participate today on behalf of the Clinton Foundation. And I am delighted that Secretary Jewell, Secretary Kerry, Attorney General Holder, and so many others are working to build on the President's executive order and advance the strategy on wildlife trafficking that is embodied in the executive order and that we unveiled at the State Department last November. Now, this audience knows very well that the problem of wildlife trafficking is one that is global, and some species are much more at risk than others, but we need a new impetus for trying to bring the world community together around preventing the continuing slaughter and trafficking of endangered species and a new ethos that would recognize the importance for all countries to respect those who share our planet with us. Now, in particular, elephant poaching and ivory trafficking have once again reached a crisis point. You know the statistics. Over the past decade, the number of elephants killed has doubled. As many as 35,000 elephants were slaughtered by poachers last year alone. That is 96 elephants killed every single day. As a result, the number of African forest elephants, which are especially at risk, has declined by more than 75% since 2002. At this rate, African forest elephants will be extinct within 10 years. Now, of course, this is an ecological disaster, but that's not all that it is. Illegal poaching and trafficking also represent an economic and security challenge in Africa and beyond. Wildlife trafficking has become more organized, more lucrative, and more dangerous than ever before. Poachers now use helicopters, automatic weapons, night vision goggles, satellite phones to overwhelm and even murder park rangers and other local authorities. They are spreading instability, undermining the rule of law, threatening the tourist trade that is the lifeblood of so many African communities. I was watching these trends, and as someone mentioned earlier, I asked the intelligence community for, I think, the first ever assessment on the security implications of wildlife poaching. Here's a small flavor of what we found. We have seen Al-Shabaab, the al-Qaeda affiliate from Somalia, the Janjaweed that have terrorized Darfur in Sudan, the Lord's Resistance Army, which has been an evil force in Central Africa now for decades, and other armed groups moving into the ivory trade and exploiting some of the same porous borders and global criminal networks that carry arms, drugs, and victims of human trafficking, creating ungoverned space. So when the intelligence community reported back, their conclusion was that wildlife trafficking presents, quote, significant security challenges for African nations and also threatens American economic and security priorities across the continent. I've also heard directly from many African leaders deeply concerned by the toll that all of this is taking on their economies, their citizens, and their wildlife. And they are appealing to the international community, especially to the consumer countries that are fueling the demand for ivory, to step up and stop this slaughter with us. So I particularly applaud the President and his team for putting wildlife trafficking on America's diplomatic agenda and reaching out to all of you, businesses, civil society groups, conservation organizations, foundations, scientists, and more. At the Clinton Foundation, we are helping pull together a coalition of African states, conservation NGOs, and other concerned parties committed to stop the killing, stop the trafficking, and stop the demand. This effort will, we believe, complement the Obama administration's initiatives by working with governments to put in place stronger laws to crack down on poaching and trafficking, to scale up on-ground enforcement, to raise public awareness about the hidden cost of ivory in countries like China, where a recent survey found that only a third of consumers understood that elephants are actually being killed to supply the luxury goods they buy. And we'll have more to say about this later this month at the Clinton Global Initiative in New York. So for me, my husband, and Chelsea, this is a personal commitment as well as a policy concern. And Chelsea, who's taken a large role in leading our foundation over the past 3 years, has really spearheaded our engagement. Through her reporting at NBC News, she worked to shine a spotlight on the crisis, and this summer, she led a Clinton Foundation delegation to visit conservation experts in Tanzania and Zambia to see firsthand some of the innovative work being done on the ground to protect Africa's elephants. Now, everything we say also goes for rhinos, tigers, and everybody else. But we've got to get back to where we were in the early 90s, when we understood you can't be a little bit pregnant, you can't be a little bit okay with buying ivory goods, because that opens the floodgates. And therefore, doing all that we can to help stop the killing, stop the trafficking, stop the demand is one of our highest priorities. Chelsea?
Thank you, Mom. This indeed has been a family prerogative for a long time. The first organization I joined was Greenpeace. The second was the World Wildlife Federation, and the third was Conservation International, largely galvanized by a concern about elephants in the mid-1980s. And so for me, elephants really were the entree into so much of what subsequently was discussed here today around security concerns, economic concerns, questions of international treaties. What is the role of government? What is the role of the private sector? What is the role of NGOs? And what can an 8-year-old girl in Little Rock do about any of it? So I'm incredibly grateful that the Clinton Foundation is now engaging in this area. I'm incredibly grateful that my mother has shown leadership in this area in the public sector and now in the nonprofit sector, giving me yet another reason to be proud to be her daughter. As she mentioned, last month I had the privilege of leading a Clinton Foundation delegation on visits to 3 elephant conservation projects, 1 in Tanzania and 2 in Zambia. They are clear testaments to what we can do when we work together. And as we heard earlier, we do know what works. We have to highlight those solutions, augment them, amplify them, and evangelize about them when necessary. In Tanzania, I was in Tarangire National Park with WCS, and not only was I awed by the elephants that I saw, whether they were 3 months old or older than my grandmother possibly was when she passed away, I was really moved by the personal commitment from WCS, from the park rangers, from the local communities that I met, and how all were working so closely in harmony together. I was probably most moved by the ranger stories. As we heard earlier from the panel, more than 1,000 rangers have been killed in the last 10 years alone. The human cost of poaching isn't only in kind of the delayed effects of what ivory can finance through the criminal syndicates, but in truly what the rangers are confronting on the front lines every day. And yet we know when there are more rangers, there are more elephants. And when there are more rangers supported by more community members, there are more elephants still. WCS and the Tanzania National Wildlife Service are proving that. We need to do everything we can to support those efforts in Tanzania and elsewhere. In Zambia, I was with the African Wildlife Foundation and Patrick, who stood up earlier and waved, seeing kind of what AWF is doing to protect the elephant corridors. Although maybe we can point out where wildlife conservation areas begin and end on a map, elephants clearly can't, respecting neither national borders nor wildlife conservation boundaries or national park welcome signs. And so protecting the corridors is fundamental to ensuring that the elephants not only can roam freely, but that they are safe from poachers. It also is important to protect the local communities. Increasing numbers of local communities' lives have also been lost. It's not only the poachers who are being killed, it's the local communities who are in the pathways of the poachers. This is important to do not only for elephants, but for local communities. And so seeing what AWF is doing to build schools, to build programs that support ecologically sound tourist efforts is affirmative not only on a human level, but it's the smart thing to do, and it signals a long-term commitment by AWF to the local communities in Zambia and all of those that are in the elephant corridors. And so we're so grateful that the Clinton Foundation has a platform to be able to highlight the good work that is already being done, to help convene members of the nonprofit sector, the public sector, private companies at CGI later this month to talk about what's working, but certainly not to be partly pregnant, and to talk about what we need to do over the next years and decades to come. Because as Judith said so eloquently, We don't want this to be a pendulum. We don't want to find ourselves back in this room, as lovely as it is, as grateful as we are to being hosted by the White House today in another 20 years. I want my daughters and sons, theoretically, to grow up not only knowing that we have elephants around the world and rhinos and tigers and sharks, but that we learn from our past mistakes and that we can cumulatively move forward and that we don't have to keep fighting the same battles over and over again. I want that to be our legacy, and I look forward to all of our work together. Thank you to the President. Thank you, Secretary Jewell. Thank you to everyone who has hosted us here today. Onward.